My name is Emma, and I am 22 years old. Just a few months ago, I married David, the man who has my heart, my trust, and my unwavering admiration. He's everything I ever wanted in a partner: steady, kind, and deeply committed to the life we're building together. When I said I do, I didn't just become a wife. I also stepped into the role of a stepmother to Liam, David's 16-year-old son. He was quiet, reserved, and undeniably protective of the life he shared with his father. I remember standing in the kitchen on our first evening together, trying to mask the tight knot of nerves in my stomach as I watched him silently poke at his dinner. His expression gave nothing away, but his posture told me everything. I was an intruder in his carefully guarded world. Being a stepmother wasn't just unfamiliar, it was terrifying. I had no idea what I was doing. I had no experience with children, let alone a teenager navigating his own coming of age. How would I ever earn his trust? Could I ever help him see that I wasn't here to replace his mother? These questions gnawed at me every time I saw him retreat into his room or avoid my attempts at small talk. But I didn't let the fear stop me. Deep down, I was determined. I loved David too much to let my own insecurities become a barrier to the family we both dreamed of. I told myself that building a bond with Liam would take time, patience, and a relentless willingness to try, even when it felt like I was failing. In those early days, I took every chance I could to close the invisible gap between us. I asked about his interests, carefully, without pushing. I'd linger by the table after dinner, hoping for even the smallest sliver of conversation. It was exhausting, like tiptoeing through a maze without a map. Yet, there were flickers of hope. A slight nod when I asked if he wanted a snack. A murmured, "Thanks," when I handed him a glass of water. They were crumbs, but they were mine, and I clung to them. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was walking a razor-thin line. Every step forward felt fragile, as if the wrong move could shatter the delicate progress we'd made. Was I doing too much, or not enough? And underneath it all was the unspoken question that loomed over every interaction. Will he ever truly accept me? I wanted to believe he would. I had to believe it. But as I stood in that house, surrounded by love yet haunted by uncertainty, I couldn't help but feel like the hardest part was yet to come. The first few days were harder than I anticipated. Liam was an enigma, quiet, withdrawn, and seemingly uninterested in acknowledging my presence. He didn't say much, barely glancing up from his plate during meals, and his responses to my attempts at conversation were clipped and distant. There was no hostility in his demeanor, but there was a wall, a thick and impenetrable one that seemed impossible to scale. I told myself to start small. I tried sharing meals with him, asking casual questions about school or his hobbies. "How was your day?" I'd venture cautiously, only to be met with a vague "fine" or a non-committal shrug. If I lingered too long, the silence between us would stretch, growing heavy and uncomfortable, until I excused myself with a polite smile. Every interaction felt like a delicate dance. I didn't want to overstep, but I also didn't want to appear indifferent. So, I kept trying, hoping that persistence would eventually chip away at his reserve. I'd offer to help with his school projects, or leave little snacks on the kitchen counter with a casual, "I thought you might like this." Small gestures, subtle overtures, anything to show him I cared without making it too obvious. But no matter what I did, the uncertainty gnawed at me. Was I being too pushy? Too eager? Did he resent me for trying to insert myself into his life? Or worse, did he simply not care? These questions followed me like shadows, leaving me second-guessing every word, every action. One evening, as I cleared the dishes from the table, I glanced at him sitting in the living room, his gaze fixed on his phone. The distance between us wasn't just physical, it felt like an ocean. I paused, gripping the edge of the sink, and wondered if this was just how it would always be. Him in his world, me in mine, connected only by the fragile thread of our shared family. But I refused to give up. I reminded myself that relationships, especially in a blended family, don't form overnight. trust takes time. Bonds take effort. And even though Liam's indifference stung, I knew I couldn't let it deter me. In quieter moments, I questioned my own role in all of this. What did it mean to be a stepmother to a teenager who hadn't asked for one? Was I supposed to be a friend, a guide, or just a background figure there but not intruding? The ambiguity of it all made me feel lost, as though I were walking a tightrope without knowing where it led. Still, there were glimmers of hope. One afternoon, I offered to help him with some chores, and he didn't brush me off. It wasn't much, just a few words exchanged while folding laundry, but it felt like progress. Another time, I caught him hesitating before leaving the kitchen, as if debating whether to say something. He didn't, but that moment of pause stayed with me. It was a slow, tentative process, like learning to navigate a maze blindfolded. I didn't know if I was making the right moves or taking wrong turns. All I knew was that I had to keep trying, no matter how small the steps or how long the journey. After all, this wasn't just about me or even Liam. This was about building a family, one fragile thread at a time. At first, it was subtle. Liam began offering small gestures that seemed almost accidental. He'd carry his empty plate to the sink without a word, or quietly pick up the remote I'd dropped. But then came the day he stood beside me as I washed the dishes. He didn't say much, only a soft, "I'll dry," before grabbing a towel. I held my breath, afraid to ruin the moment with too much enthusiasm. It became a pattern. Once in a while, he'd silently join me while I cleaned the house, picking up a broom or folding a towel without being asked. I noticed how he started lingering in shared spaces, no longer disappearing into his room immediately after dinner. These weren't grand gestures, but they felt monumental to me. Each small action, each fleeting moment of connection, was like a crack of light breaking through the walls he'd built. I couldn't help but feel a cautious sense of hope. Was this progress? Was he beginning to trust me, even just a little? I wanted to believe we were finally moving forward, that the silence was shifting into something more comfortable, something almost familiar. There was one evening in particular that stayed with me. I was setting the table when I noticed Liam hovering near the kitchen doorway. "Need help?" he asked, his voice barely louder than a whisper. I almost dropped the plate I was holding. "Sure," I replied, trying to sound casual, though my heart was racing. We worked side by side, arranging dishes and pouring water into glasses. At one point, our hands brushed as we reached for the same fork. He pulled back quickly, mumbling an apology. But instead of retreating, he stayed. That small interaction felt like a breakthrough, a sign that maybe, just maybe, we were starting to figure out how to exist in each other's lives. I began to imagine a future where our family felt whole, where Liam saw me as someone he could rely on, not just his father's wife, but a steady presence in his world. I allowed myself to dream of shared laughter, of conversations that didn't feel forced, of moments when the three of us felt like a real family. Still, there was a part of me that remained cautious. Liam was still reserved, and his openness came and went like the tide, never predictable, never fully steady. I wondered if I was reading too much into his actions, clinging to crumbs and mistaking them for a feast, but my heart told me otherwise. These small signs of progress gave me strength. They reassured me that my efforts weren't in vain, that the time and care I'd invested were beginning to bear fruit. For the first time since I entered this family, I felt something I hadn't dared to feel before. Optimism. It started so subtly that I didn't realize something was off until much later. At first, Liam's teasing felt innocent, even a little endearing. He would joke while we did chores together, nudging me lightly when I folded a towel wrong, or making a playful comment about how I always forgot to add enough detergent to the washing machine. I remember one day vividly. We were hanging laundry in the backyard, and he held up one of my shirts, grinning. "Is this supposed to be this small?" he asked, mock confusion on his face. I rolled my eyes, laughing it off as just a silly attempt at humor. Moments like that felt normal, even refreshing, a reminder that maybe he was growing comfortable enough around me to let his guard down. But then there were other moments, ones that didn't feel quite so lighthearted. Like when I was washing dishes, and he came up behind me, suddenly wrapping his arms around my shoulders in what seemed like an overly familiar hug. I froze, startled, and mumbled something about needing to finish cleaning up. He stepped away without a word, but my hands trembled as I rinsed the plates. I told myself it didn't mean anything. He was young, I reasoned, probably just awkward and unsure about boundaries. Maybe this was his way of expressing affection in a family dynamic he was still navigating. I wanted to believe that, needed to believe that, because the alternative was something I couldn't bear to consider. But as time went on, these moments became harder to dismiss. Sometimes, when we were cleaning together, I'd catch him standing a little too close, his gaze lingering in ways that made me uncomfortable. Other times, his jokes felt less like harmless fun and more like subtle provocations, hints of something I didn't want to name. I started to dread being alone with him, though I hated admitting that even to myself. Every time I felt his presence too near or saw him watching me out of the corner of my eye, my chest tightened with a mix of unease and guilt. I wondered if I was overreacting, if my own insecurities were clouding my judgment. But the knot in my stomach told me otherwise. My inner conflict was relentless. Was I imagining things? Misinterpreting his actions? Or was there something deeper happening, something neither of us knew how to address? I tried to push the thoughts away, reminding myself that he was just a teenager, probably still figuring out his own emotions. It happened on an otherwise unremarkable day. I was tidying up the living room, absent-mindedly folding a blanket, when Liam walked in. He stood there for a moment, hovering near the doorway, as though debating whether to step closer or turn back. Something about his posture made me pause. I straightened up, blanket still in hand, and waited. "I need to tell you something," he said, his voice low but steady. I nodded, expecting a casual remark or a question about dinner, but the words that followed struck like a thunderclap. "I think I have feelings for you." The room seemed to tilt, the air thick and stifling. For a second, I thought I'd misheard him, that my mind had twisted his words into something impossible. But his expression, serious, unwavering, told me otherwise. "Liam," I managed, my voice barely above a whisper. "What are you saying?" He stepped closer, hands fidgeting nervously, but his gaze didn't falter. "I've been trying to ignore it, but I can't. I like you. Not just as my stepmom. More than that." I couldn't breathe. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might break through my ribs. Fear, sadness, disbelief. They all surged at once, tangling into a knot so tight I could barely think. This couldn't be happening. It wasn't right. "Liam," I said, my voice firmer now, though it trembled at the edges. "You need to stop. Whatever you're feeling, it's not what you think. I love your father, and I care for you as his son. That's all." "I know it's wrong," he admitted, his tone almost pleading. "But I can't help it. You're here every day and you're different. You make me feel understood in a way no one else does." His words cut deeper than I wanted to admit. I didn't know whether to feel pity for his confusion or anger at the boundaries he had crossed. "You're mistaken," I said, forcing as much calm into my voice as I could muster. "What you're feeling isn't real, Liam. It's not love. It's just—" I searched for the right words but came up empty. "It's not appropriate. This has to stop. Now." For a moment, he said nothing, just looked at me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. Then, without another word, he turned and left the room, leaving me frozen in place, clutching the blanket as though it were the only thing keeping me upright. I thought I'd been clear, that my words had drawn an unbreakable line. But the tension in the house didn't dissipate. If anything, it grew thicker, more oppressive. I could feel it in the way Liam avoided my gaze during meals, in the way he lingered in doorways as though debating whether to say more. I had hoped my words would have been enough, that drawing a firm line would make Liam step back and understand the gravity of what he'd confessed. But it quickly became clear that wasn't the case. If anything, his behavior only grew more unsettling, more deliberate. At first, it was subtle. A lingering hand when he passed me a dish, standing too close when we crossed paths in the hallway. Then it became harder to ignore. He'd find excuses to touch me, brushing my shoulder as he walked by, or placing a hand on my arm for just a moment too long. Each interaction made my stomach twist into tighter knots. I started to notice how he seemed to always be around, no matter what I was doing. If I was in the kitchen, he'd find a reason to be there too, opening the fridge or leaning against the counter. If I was folding laundry, he'd suddenly appear, offering to help, but making me feel exposed in ways I couldn't explain. It felt calculated, like he was testing how far he could go without outright defying the boundaries I'd set. I tried to keep my distance, but it was impossible in a house this small. Every time I turned a corner, it felt like he was there, watching, waiting. I began to dread the sound of his footsteps, the quiet moments when David wasn't home, the hours that stretched endlessly when it was just the two of us. Pushing him away too harshly felt risky. What if I alienated him completely? What if he told David something twisted or untrue? But tolerating his actions felt just as unbearable. I was trapped, teetering on the edge of a situation I didn't know how to control. There was one moment I'll never forget. I was cleaning up after dinner, my back to the room, when I felt him behind me. His presence was so close it sent a chill down my spine. I froze, gripping the edge of the sink, willing myself to stay calm. "Do you need something, Liam?" I asked, keeping my voice steady, though my pulse was racing. "No," he said quietly, but he didn't move. I could feel his gaze on me, heavy and invasive, and I wanted nothing more than to run. But I stayed rooted in place, forcing myself to breathe, to keep control. Eventually, he walked away without another word, but the fear lingered long after he was gone. Each day became a careful dance of avoidance and endurance. I stopped being in the same room with him unless absolutely necessary. I made excuses to leave the house when David wasn't home, but even then, the tension never left me. At night, I lay awake replaying every moment, questioning my own judgment. Was I doing enough to stop this? Should I tell David? Would he even believe me? The pressure was suffocating, a constant weight pressing on my chest. I couldn't go on like this, but I didn't know what to do. All I knew was that something had to change, and soon, before the cracks in our family became irreparable. The breaking point came one evening when I found myself sitting at the dining table long after dinner, staring at the untouched plate of food in front of me. My hands trembled as I clutched the edge of the chair, the weight of the past few weeks pressing down on me like a storm I couldn't escape. I couldn't do this alone anymore. Liam's behavior wasn't just unsettling, it was consuming my every thought. I had tried to rationalize it, to push through, but it had become clear that ignoring the problem wasn't an option. My mental and emotional state was unraveling. Every sound in the house, every moment we were alone, felt like a ticking clock. It wasn't just my sense of safety at stake, it was the fragile harmony of our family. I realized I had to tell David. The man I loved, the man I had vowed to build a life with, needed to know what was happening in his own home. But the thought of the conversation made my stomach churn. How could I explain without shattering the trust between father and son? How could I make David understand the gravity of the situation without making Liam feel cornered or attacked? I spent hours that night crafting the words in my mind, rehearsing different versions of the conversation. Each one ended with a knot of doubt. What if David didn't believe me? What if he thought I was exaggerating, or worse, that I had somehow encouraged Liam's behavior? The fear of being misunderstood was paralyzing, but it was outweighed by the urgency of the situation. I knew this wasn't just about me. If I stayed silent, I'd be failing not only myself, but also David, and even Liam. He was a young man struggling with emotions he didn't fully understand, and pretending the problem didn't exist wasn't helping him either. The next morning, as I washed the dishes, I found myself watching the clock. David would be home from his work trip in just a few hours. I had always looked forward to his return, but now I felt nothing but dread. My chest tightened at the thought of seeing his face, of watching the expression in his eyes change as I told him the truth. I tried to keep busy, cleaning the house, organizing the pantry, anything to keep my mind from spiraling. But as the minutes ticked by, the knot in my stomach only grew tighter. By the time I heard David's car pull into the driveway, my hands were clammy, and my heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. As he walked through the door, smiling and carrying his overnight bag, I forced myself to return his hug. But my movements were stiff, and I could tell he noticed. "Everything okay?" he asked, concern flickering in his eyes. I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. "We need to talk," I said, my voice quieter than I intended. He looked at me, the smile fading, replaced by a seriousness that mirrored my own. "What's going on?" I motioned for him to sit down, my hands trembling as I joined him at the table. This was it. The moment I had dreaded, the moment I knew would change everything. Sitting across from David at the dining table, I felt like I was balancing on the edge of a cliff. The words I needed to say clung to the back of my throat, heavy and immovable, but I forced them out. Piece by piece, I told him everything: Liam's confession, his actions, and the escalating discomfort I had tried so hard to manage on my own. David listened in silence, his expression shifting from confusion to disbelief, and then something darker: hurt, anger, and a hint of guilt. When I finished, the room felt unbearably still. I couldn't tell if the weight of my words had shattered our bond or strengthened it. "I had no idea," David finally said, his voice low but steady. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" Tears welled in my eyes as I tried to explain. "I didn't know how. I was scared of how you'd react, of what it would do to our family." He nodded, though his jaw tightened, and I could see the storm brewing beneath his calm exterior. "We need to talk to him, together." I agreed, even though the thought of facing Liam made my pulse race. Within minutes, David called him into the room. Liam appeared in the doorway, hesitant but curious. The moment he saw both of us seated together, his expression shifted to wary suspicion. He sat down reluctantly, avoiding my gaze. David didn't waste any time. "Liam," he began, his tone firm but controlled. "Emma just told me about what's been happening while I've been gone, about the things you've said and done." Liam's head snapped up, his eyes wide. "She told you?" he asked, his voice laced with a mix of disbelief and defensiveness. "Yes, she did," David replied. "And now we're going to talk about it. All of it." The next hour felt like a delicate operation, with each word carefully measured to keep emotions from boiling over. I explained how Liam's behavior had made me feel violated, uneasy, and trapped. I told him that while I cared for him deeply as his stepmother, his actions crossed boundaries that couldn't be ignored. At first, Liam was defensive. "I didn't mean to hurt you," he insisted. I didn't know how else to show how I felt." "You don't get to make her feel unsafe," David interjected, his voice sharper now. "What you've done isn't love, Liam. It's selfish. You put her in an impossible position, and that's not fair to her, or to me." The tension in the room was suffocating. But slowly, as the conversation unfolded, Liam's defensiveness began to crack. He looked down at his hands, his shoulders slumping under the weight of realization. "I didn't think about it like that," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean for it to get this far." David leaned forward, his tone softening just enough to let Liam know he wasn't alone. "It's okay to have feelings, son. But how you handle them matters. What you've done is wrong, but this is your chance to learn from it and make things right." The rawness of the moment left us all emotionally drained, but it also brought a fragile sense of clarity. For the first time in weeks, I felt like we were finally addressing the problem instead of letting it fester. Moving forward wasn't easy. The days that followed were filled with awkward silences and tentative steps toward rebuilding trust. David worked closely with Liam, helping him process his emotions and understand the impact of his actions. I kept my distance when necessary but remained open to gradual reconciliation. In time, Our family began to heal. Liam grew more respectful of boundaries, and I found a renewed sense of safety in my own home. While the scars of the experience remained, they served as a reminder of the importance of honesty, communication, and the strength it takes to confront difficult truths. This wasn't the family I had envisioned when I married David, but it was ours, and together, we were learning how to navigate the imperfections and rebuild what had been broken. If you've read my story up to this point, I want to take a moment to turn to you. What are your thoughts on everything I've shared? If you were in my position, how would you have handled this delicate and painful situation? Would you have acted sooner, said something different, or taken another approach entirely? If you were to rate this story, my life, my decisions, on a scale of 1 to 10, where would it land? And more importantly, why? I genuinely want to hear your perspective. Your feedback matters because it helps me understand not just how I could have done better, but how others might view the choices I made. Take a moment to leave a comment below. Share your insights, your advice, or even your own stories if you've faced something similar. Your voice matters, and your input could make a difference, not just for me, but for others who may be grappling with their own challenges. And if this story resonated with you, please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to my channel. There are more stories waiting to be told, stories that will move you, challenge you, and maybe even inspire you. Thank you for being part of this journey, and I hope your day is filled with meaningful connections and a touch of luck.